Welcome old friends, and perhaps even some new ones, to a class that is a revival of a class that started 35 years ago at an institution in Beijing, Youdian Xueyuan. It was 35 years ago that I had an opportunity to meet some really wonderful Chinese students as I was teaching there and offer them what we called a special class. And the reason it was a special class was that it had no tests, it had no exams, it wasn't a regularly scheduled class. It was sort of a class that my students and I just sort of invented to give me an opportunity to share with them some thoughts and ideas about the world that we live in and how we can understand it better. This class will be similar. It is an asynchronous class, though we're going to have some perhaps opportunities to get together on Zoom. There'll be no tests, no examinations, no requirements, no expectations, except that hopefully you may find something engaging and interesting and educational about this class. This class is called Words That Shape Our World, and the organizing principle of this class is based upon the video that you may have already seen by Yuval Harari about why humans run the world. He makes a point there that one of the things that enables humans to be the dominant creature on this planet is our ability to create narratives. And by creating narratives, which are all based upon language and words, by creating such narratives, we're able to convince people to believe things, to do things, to take actions, etc., and so on. And so therefore, words and these sorts of narratives are in many ways the building blocks of the world that we live in. And perhaps it's appropriate to start with an observation by the disciple John in the Christian Bible, the New Testament, John 1:1, in which he says, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God." Now, I've reflected upon this a lot, and it would appear to me that this may be an inspiration by John or an insight by John in how valuable words are, because words really do create the world. And consequently, words, by creating the world, enable us to have our understanding of the world and our understanding of each other. Words themselves may very well meet the classic definition of what a deity is. The classic definition of a deity is that a deity has to be omnipotent, omnipresent, and omniscient. Omnipotent meaning all-powerful. And we understand that by our use of language, we can create things, we can move things, we can exercise power in ways that individually we might not be able to do, but collectively we certainly can as groups of people and civilizations. The second key element of definition of a deity is that they have to be omnipresent. Okay, and omnipresent means has to be everywhere. Well, words are everywhere. Everybody has a language. Everybody has a term for this. Everybody has a concept of what this is and what that is. We have names and we make lists and we organize our thinking along the lines of what words enable us to do. And the third element of the definition of a deity is that it has to be omniscient, all-knowing. Well, since words themselves are the vehicle by which we create understanding or give voice to understanding, then most obviously words are omniscient. And so consequently, John may have really hit the target when he said the Word was God. Words perhaps may be God in the sense that they give shape to virtually everything else about our world. Of course, the evolution of our words and our language comes from our ability to make specific sounds and complex and sophisticated sounds. We're not the only animals on this earth that make sound, but we're the only ones that can articulate ideas as precisely and clearly as we can. This gives just a little indication of how sophisticated and complex our ability to make sounds and to produce spoken language really is. All of you who speak Chinese understand how complex this is, and any of you who are not Chinese who are trying to learn Chinese and have to address a tonal language understand how challenging it might very well be. Of course, the chief enabler of language and the eventual development of the transmission of sophisticated ideas orally and even in other forms, visually and so on, is dependent upon the size of the brain of the organism that's trying to do the communication. You can see by this chart that the human brain is significantly larger than its near relative, the Western gorilla. And though it might not be as large in volume as the African bush elephant, you can see that it has quite a few more neurons in it. And those neurons are the tools or the mechanisms by which messages and ideas and concepts and the formation of words and so on swirl around the brain and get put together in some intelligible way. And what enables the brain to do all of this is that the fact that the brain consumes a massive amount of calories. The brain runs quite a bit of energy, or needs quite a bit of energy to operate as it does. And those calories get funneled into the brain, and they provide all the fuel necessary for the sorts of thinking and communications that we humans have developed. Interestingly, the ability of humans to acquire the necessary calories to fuel the human evolution, and particularly the evolution of the brain, is related to the fact that humans found a way to master and utilize fire. By doing that, the humans created the possibility of cooking food. In essence, cooking, including not only heat, but also the mechanical processes such as chopping and grinding, outsources some of the body's work of digestion so that more energy is extracted from food and less expended in processing it. Cooking breaks down collagen, the connective tissue in meat, and softens the cell walls of plants to release their store of starches and fats. Cooking freed up time, as well as the great apes spent 4 to 7 hours a day just chewing, not an activity that prioritizes the intellect. Eventually, speech and the more sophisticated ideas that began to generate themselves into the brains of Homo sapiens and so on begin to have visual references and visual symbolic representations as well. So in some cases, the earliest language, certainly the earliest written language, actually is a series of pictures. Pictures that we can find all over the world where humans are trying to represent things that they want or think of or desire, or perhaps even things that they find to be sacred or holy. Eventually, pictographic languages also began to evolve and develop abstract symbols. And abstract symbols could represent either ideas or could represent the sounds of words, and the words themselves, of course, representing ideas. Here again, we return to the original quote that started this lesson. The relationship between words and things that are holy, things that are sacred, things that are otherworldly, godly, or some form of deity. But though we don't tend to think about it, clothing was part of the development of early written language, or at least the articulation of ideas through visual symbolic references. As all cultures and societies began to develop wardrobes that quite easily designated and differentiated people, classes of people, roles, and the functions that people had within society, so that other people could almost instantly, upon looking upon somebody, have a sense of how to relate to them and how they might engage in conversation with them or interactions with them. Of course, the same thing is true even today. These two pictures represent people who are clearly wearing clothing in such a way that designate their role and function within society. And you can guess by looking at the clothing and guessing and knowing the role and function of the various people in these pictures and so on, you can probably get some ideas about their politics, about their values, about their culture, and so on. So instantly, there are visual references, which in essence represents a written language that people can pick up on upon immediately looking at somebody just by looking at their clothes. But humans are not the only species capable of organizing activity. If you click on this slide, you can watch a video that'll show how a group of chimpanzees, using oral calls, words, language, or so on, begin to organize a violent attack upon another group of chimpanzees and the territory of another group of chimpanzees. Now, the reason they're doing this probably has to do with caloric intake. On the one hand, the one group of chimpanzees is going to be expanding its territory, trying to assert control over a space that has calories in it, but also it is now known that chimpanzees are actually cannibalistic. They will actually eat the bodies of their victims through these warfare and aggressive actions and so on. So their brains, hungering calories, may have triggered them to evolve into aggressive and violent behaviors. But if we look at another group of primates in Africa, the bonobos, we see that this did not have to be the case. Bonobos developed and evolved in a physical space that was just fertile with food and calories and had plenty of resources in it, so that eating was not a problem for them. And in fact, bonobos themselves developed a habit of eating shoots and leaves and so on, not necessarily for their caloric intake, and I don't suppose it was because they tasted good, but bonobos accidentally discovered that if they kept their stomachs full, then on these sort of snacks, you might call them, then they weren't voraciously running around and doing activities looking constantly for food. When they did find caloric sources and so on, then they would gnaw and chew on those and take those in. The result was the bonobos developed a larger culture among themselves. They traditionally operated in groups of about 16 or more. And because life was easy for them, they didn't have to compete with each other for food and so on. It turns out that when it came to competing with chimpanzees, who lived on both sides of them, the bonobos were also at an advantage in that chimpanzees generally break up into groups of about 7 or 8 in order to go out and hunt for food and so on. With bonobos organized in groups of about 16, bonobos found that they almost always outnumbered their potential enemies, the chimpanzees. And so therefore chimpanzees tended to leave them alone, and bonobos did not have to develop even defensive aggression, shall we say, or defensive warfare capabilities, etc., and so on. So bonobos began to be rather peaceful and began to have a life that was concentrated more on basically what are the rudimentary elements of family life and enjoying each other's company and so on. And they may teach humans something about this in some cases. However, the result is that bonobos were few, and eventually chimpanzees and aggressive species seeking massive amounts of calories or seeking their own food sources and so on tended to outnumber the peaceful types. And consequently, the evolutionary train may have been put on a track headed towards the continued evolution of the ability to be aggressive and warlike and violent, which of course produces human beings. So now, I hope you enjoyed the lesson for this week and that you found something to think about in this and something worthy of your reflection and consideration and so on. Our next lesson, I'm going to focus in on the concept of place, which is related to, for example, the differentiation between chimpanzees and the culture that they evolved and bonobos and the culture that they evolved, and our human concepts of place to help explain more of how the world we live in today is evolved by the narratives and the ideas and the thoughts that we generate about what it is that we experience. Until we get together in whatever way we do, I hope that you can all be happy and that you can all stay healthy.